live on Facebook. Thanks so much for joining us. If you are joining us there, we are streaming live over the next half hour or so, going to the live TV show in about 5 minutes from now. But keep your comments coming into us on Facebook. Today we're talking about Donald Trump and his foreign policy. Is it working? Is it an effective policy? He's certainly got a lot of fires going on all sorts of fronts at the moment. We're using this question, Andrew, to kind of like counter it to the domestic scene that's behind the president at the moment. So much turmoil back in Washington, and yet this is a president who doesn't seem at all shy about, you know, poking the bears abroad.
No, and I think that's strategy for him. And I think when you look at the question is it working, depends what your definition of working and what audience you're trying to serve. I think for Donald Trump, the maximum chaos with him in the middle of it suits him quite well. Now, is he solving any of the problems out there in the world with Iran, North Korea, trade policy around the world? Maybe not. He started a lot of conversations. He's thrown a lot up in the air, and we don't know where it's going to land yet. But it's a useful counterpoint to his domestic turmoil to say, look at me, I'm doing things. They're stopping me from doing things. Yeah. It's all a witch hunt. They're trying to stop us from achieving what we want. And as long as he gets that out of it, I think he's quite happy with his foreign policy.
Are you thinking about who his audience is? If it is his base and supporters looking ahead to the election next year, do people care about what's going on outside of their state, let alone their country?
They don't care about the nitty-gritty and the detail, and they don't care about whether he's been a sort of task completer and actually got the job done. But they care about Trump. He's their guy. Trump's had a turbulent time domestically, and the Mueller report was seen as he and his fans took it as a vindication, but there's still lots of kind of sort of unanswered questions still swirling around. So what he always does quite effectively is he pivots into international issues, as Andrew said, and, you know, kind of sends a signal to his base saying, look, I'm really, you know, bossing it on the big world stage. I'm putting America first. I'm making America the sort of policeman of the world again. So I think they quite like it. And the beauty of the strategy for him is they don't care about what happens. So in their mind, they think he solved the North Korea issue. The fact that North Korea, the talks are broken down and they're now testing nuclear missiles again, that doesn't matter to them. They'll see that as fake news. They won't even get that information. Yeah, and Liam, like turmoil at home, but also a certain amount of economic calm, if you like, or growth. I mean, the American economy is doing well. So one wonders why, when he could be just championing that, he's still determined to make waves abroad.
Yes, very strong numbers out of the US first quarter growth came out just before the weekend, growing at over 3%. Barack Obama never achieved that, and of course Trump will take the credit. We can debate whether or not that's going to fade as his tax cut impact of that fades. We can talk about massive debts that the US is racking up because a lot of this growth is coming through government spending. But as my colleagues have said, the Mueller report is out, of course, in a redacted form. Now there's a row about whether some of those redactions should be derobed, demasked, if you like, via the House Judiciary Committee, calling Robert Mueller to speak. Trump previously said it's his decision, the special counsel's decision, whether or not he appears before this Democrat-controlled committee.
The Attorney General as well. He put it all on the Attorney General.
Now Trump's saying, actually, I don't think Mueller should appear. And there was confusion in the last 24 hours about whether a date had been set or not for Mueller to appear in front of that committee. So, of course, he sets off a flurry of activity via his Twitter account, via US Navy manoeuvres, to get us all talking about foreign policy.
Yeah, and we're just about to come up to the TV show right now, I think. But in the meantime, whilst we're still a bit of a delay before we go to it, talking about Mueller and the special counsel, it's really a question now of not when, but not if, rather, but when. It's pretty certain that this silent man is now going to speak. Right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, he's rowing into a pretty strong current now that they've had 1.5, 2 months of this disinformation or reframing of his report the way the Attorney General and the President wanted it. So he's going to have to walk a lot of that perception back. And again, with Trump supporters, he's never going to achieve that. But even amongst fair-minded people now, they've heard a certain version of the Mueller report. And I think it will be blockbuster ratings when the man himself comes, because he has kept his mouth shut the entire time since his appointment. And this guy could not be a more rock-ribbed Republican, member of the establishment, well-respected on either side. Mueller. Yeah. And
people forget that he's...
But Trump's great skills.
Welcome to a new week of CNN Talk. We are today talking about Donald Trump again. The question is Trump's foreign policy working? There's a lot of foreign policy activity going on, especially today as well. We'll get to that in a second. First, take a look at this.
It's a good thing, and we want to have good relationships with every country.
Markets feeling the impact as US President Donald Trump threatens to raise tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods.
Warning shots from North Korea as frustration over the nuclear standoff intensifies.
The United States is sending more warships and bombers to the Middle East. This a response to what it says are troubling warnings and threats from Iran.
The crisis in Venezuela rapidly turning into a standoff between the U.S. and Russia.
Several senior administration officials have accused the Kremlin of intervening,
All while railing against what the president sees as a witch hunt back home.
President Trump says Mueller should not testify before Congress about the Russia probe that he spearheaded.
Streaming live on Facebook right now. Some of you have already joined us and you've been sending your messages, your comments in. The address is facebook.com/CNNI. Also, don't forget that you can check out the CNN Talk podcast. Search on Apple or whoever you get your podcasts through for CNN Talk. And you can, well, eventually you'll be able to listen back to this show and all the previous ones as well. Right, let's get to it. So we're talking about Trump's foreign policy. Is it working? Probably best to kick things off by looking at the challenges at play at the moment. You can see it's pretty much, well, it is completely across the globe right now. We've got Venezuela, obviously the political situation, the crisis happening there at the moment. Right now, Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, is meeting with Sergei Lavrov of Russia in Finland to discuss that. Also, we've got the US is now deploying a carrier ship, the USS Abraham Lincoln, to try and keep Iran at bay as well. Also, and then in China, we heard from the president that he's sort of upping this trade war. I think there's a Friday deadline on that. If they can't get a deal, there would be more tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. North Korea, Middle East crisis, and all the backdrop of this, of course, back in Washington, where the White House is, and the Mueller investigation. Let's maybe start with North Korea. We saw for the first time that Kim Jong-un has tested what seems to be a ballistic missile for the first time since 2017. CNN actually had exclusive access to this image, which shows a smoke trail, which is effectively evidence that it did indeed take place. And we also had images of Kim Jong-un seemingly personally supervising this, whether he pressed the button or not, I don't know. Your take first, I don't know who wants to jump in on this first, about whether on North Korea, Trump's foreign policy is working.
Well, I think if you back that up and look at has foreign policy worked in North Korea for the last 25 or 30 years, since the days of Clinton, Madeleine Albright, trying to put a point on this discussion, and it hasn't worked then. And I think, you know, I didn't fault Trump for trying a different tack and engaging directly, but a year plus on now from his first meeting with Kim Jong-un, it's not clear that anything has gotten better at all. Yes, we haven't trickled over into more serious things, but we are now back to the same point where we've always been, with the belligerent regime testing missiles that can harm U.S. allies. And we've had a year plus of Donald Trump marginalizing those allies in this discussion, whether that's China, Russia, or others that have traditionally tried to help mediate this discussion. So I don't think we've moved the ball backwards or forwards. I think we're stuck in the same place we've been for 25, 30 years.
I'd combine the China situation with North Korea, because there's no way he's going to get success in North Korea, and the talks have been stalled for, is it 2 months now? The Hanoi talks. Unless
After that disastrous summit, of course.
Unless China wants him to get success. China controls whether or not US sanctions on North Korea bite. China controls food and fuel supplies into Kim Jong-un's North Korea. And it strikes me, if he's escalating tensions in the trade war with China, when we all thought there was going to be a deal this week, we thought there'd be a deal this Wednesday, a 100-strong delegation of Chinese officials with the deputy president were meant to go to Washington. That seems to be off now. And unless, that's why China has so much power in these trade negotiations, because China could control whether the trade negotiation works out, a major part of foreign policy, and also whether his strategy in North Korea works out.
Yeah, I want to bring in a couple of messages. Of course it isn't, as in, of course, Trump's policy isn't working. Kim is firing missiles and ISIS is resurging. No, isn't North Korea enough of an answer to your question? However, Steve says Trump is doing a really great job. So, you know, he still obviously has some support out there. Going back to North Korea, though, in the immediate aftermath of this test, President Trump did tweet. He said the following. Anything in this interesting world is possible, but I believe Kim Jong-un fully realizes the great economic potential of his country. He also knows that I am with him and does not want to break his promise to me. Deal will happen. I mean, he could have responded in such a different way. I mean, the Times says that this was a prudent response from a president, praising him for that kind of response.
Listen, how low is the bar set? Just because he's not, like, cussing the guy, we're like, oh, my God, give him a medal, amazing. You know, we all fall for Trump's tricks. He is the ultimate PR president. You know, he's all about the photo shoot. He's all about the optic. And, you know, we all around the world, in every single newsroom, every single commentator dances to his tune. Not so long ago, we were talking about Trump possibly getting the Nobel Peace Prize because he'd done a photo call with Kim Jong-un. Now, here we are, as Andrew said, you know, a year on in, we've made no progress. All we've actually managed to do, yes, they're not tweeting each other in sort of, you know, trash talk anymore, exactly. Yeah. And, you know, they're not trash talking each other. However, the North Koreans have given up nothing. They've given up some of the remains of some American soldiers and all that kind of thing, and there's been some unification in terms of families getting together. But in terms of the material point of getting rid of the nuclear weapons, nothing has happened. And all Trump has managed to do is elevate Kim Jong-un to be the same status as other world leaders.
And put himself in that conversation.
Absolutely. And the things are going so badly. Only last week, who did Kim Jong-un meet with to try and break the deadlock? Putin. That's not a sign that these talks are going well. And I'm afraid Trump supporters are being played like a cheap fiddle on this. They think that their man has done the job. He absolutely has not done the job.
But I think that message is interesting from the president, and it would have worked.
The tweet, is it?
If there was a domestic audience in North Korea to listen to it, that would be quite effective, saying, you know, he is the roadblock to your prosperity. That is a message that you would send to a Soviet dissident, you know, 20, 30, 35 years ago, to try to get them sweet to your intervention. But that doesn't work in North Korea because they have a virtual blackout on information. So who are you speaking to there? Yeah, exactly.
James says Trump's foreign policies are making America hated again. But in terms of, like, whether Trump's given anything up on North Korea, I mean, you could argue that, no, he hasn't yet, because the one thing they want is sanctions relief, and he hasn't given that.
I mean, I think Aisha's right, and we've debated this North Korea situation many times on CNN Talk over the last 12 to 18 months. Look, if you're going to get a deal in North Korea, and a deproliferation deal, then China are going to be involved. The Russians are going to be involved. That's just a geopolitical reality. And what I would say is this show of recalcitrance, if you like, from Kim Jong-un will have been sanctioned by Beijing. He wouldn't dare to do it otherwise. So it does spill over into the trade talks. But I'd also say that it may provoke a change of direction from Trump, in the sense that he's always been going for what he's called in his tweets the big enchilada deal. The whole thing. Trump pushes the North Koreans to just give up their nuclear weapons entirely, and then those sanctions, US sanctions backed by the Chinese and the Russians for the most part, as Andrew said, will then be lifted. That's obviously the big reveal he wanted to present. Nobel Peace Prize worthy it would be. It may be now that there's a more gradual, incremental approach to this, when the North Koreans give up something, sanctions come off a little bit. I think that's what's going to now happen.
I'm interested to see more about your link between China and North Korea on the economic side as well, because we have seen, obviously, after this rocket test, a missile test, then we suddenly saw Donald Trump announce that there would be potentially more tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. They've got to come up with some kind of solution to that by Friday, apparently. Are they linked?
I'm not in the talks. I do talk to lots of diplomats, and we can surmise, looking at the history of trade talks over the years, they're always linked in with geopolitics and indeed military manoeuvres. Trump's accusing the Chinese of rowing back on previous concessions they'd made during these negotiations. Financial markets had almost priced in a deal this week. That's why we've seen some good economic news recently, and that's why they've reacted with umbrage in Asia and now...
We could bring up probably a full screen of like
London
what's happened with the markets
the futures
globally.
markets for Wall Street before they open. We've seen 4 or 5% falls. These are huge amounts of money because the world doesn't want to see, the financial world doesn't want to see a new trade war between what are the 2 biggest economies on earth. We mustn't forget.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump has tweeted as well about China ahead of the talks, which will presumably take place in Washington this week. The trade deal with China continues, but too slowly as they attempt to renegotiate.
I mean, Trump does have a point on China. They have been stealing intellectual property, and America has an enormous trade deficit with the Chinese. They do have to do something about it.
But his answer is always, let's penalize the American consumer. And
I agree.
So you have very angry American farmers. You have very angry people that are used to buying cheap Chinese goods. So he's punishing home to try to get a deal abroad, which isn't usually the way you do these things. You try to do it the other way. And the other thing that comes to me when you look at all these things is the need, shock, for diplomacy and having allies. And where's Japan in this conversation? And this whole idea of putting Donald Trump front and center on every issue has never worked for an American president. America has always exercised its power most effectively when it has its friends on board, whether that's the Second World War, whether that's the Cold War, whether that's setting up the global trade system as we know it today. That has been a partnership. And this whole idea of America alone or America first just doesn't jive with that.
It's not even America alone, it's Donald Trump alone. It's basically Donald Trump going into rooms by himself or hitting the tweet deck. That is basically how America, and you're right, he's a sort of post-protocol president from that point of view, because the choreography, whether it's economic relations, whether it's diplomatic relations, whether it's military kind of things, there's a way of doing things. Often the civil servants go in as Sherpas, first of all. A lot of work is done behind the scenes. Then often quite at the last minute, the big leaders are sort of brought in together. He's doing that completely differently. He's bypassing often his very, very senior advisors, certainly on North Korea, his sort of defense security advisors were like, that's not the kind of thing you should be doing. Also, he has this kind of in his head, and by the way, he's not even that good a businessman as the legacy would say, his art of the deal thing means that he thinks if he sort of pulls a fast one like this right on the brink of a crucial negotiation, he thinks that will strengthen his hand. But that's not often how the Chinese are very, very strategic game players. And as Liam said, they're very, very big, and they like to do things very slowly.
I want to just interrupt because the president is actually live tweeting right now about China. So the latest
What's he saying about Asia?
This is full screen.
Get that Muslim off the screen.
The United States has been losing for many years $600 to $800 billion a year on trade. With China, we lose $500 billion. Sorry, we're not going to be doing that anymore. Basically reiterating what you were just saying.
He's made it worse. He's made the trade deficit worse.
I mean, who knows? But I know a lot of people in financial markets are positioning themselves for the following scenario, where this flare-up at the end is the last-ditch effort to get minor concessions on both sides before a deal is actually being done. There are very credible people, very knowledgeable ex-diplomats too, saying that that is where we are. I don't know if that's going to happen, but as Andrew says, he is causing harm to the US economy. Yes, some steel workers have benefited from these high tariffs on imported Chinese steel, but guess what? There are only 250,000 US steel workers. There are 7 million workers in the US in factories that use steel as their main import, and that steel's become more expensive because he slapped these tariffs on China. And the Chinese want a deal too because their economy
and countries like Canada too. Let's not forget, in the European Union, he slapped these tariffs on a lot of friends under specious national security grounds.
But also, it's kind of bad news for us. We're hoping that if we come out of the EU, that America will be our new overlord when it comes to trade. And if you're dealing with somebody so capricious and so unpredictable, then this is pretty scary stuff.
Messages coming in, bluster, hubris and headlines are not a foreign policy. Trump's foreign policy is working perfectly from all indications. And so far, lots of hot air, but no results. We have lots of other areas of the world to talk about as well as far as US foreign policy is concerned. So join us after the break. We're still streaming live on Facebook.
I talked to a few people in Washington, and you go, senior positions at the State Department that have never been filled under this administration. Like, you basically have that most senior level of Mandarin that gets cleared out with the change of administration, where virtually no one has been appointed.
So they still haven't been appointed now?
They're working
What are we
with a
talking
skeleton.
about, like thousands of jobs?
It's at least hundreds of very senior
Wow.
diplomats, and it's terrifying, because they're the ones, to your point, Aisha, that go in and do that spade work
his
before.
narrative is always that all of this is corrupt, all of this is disease, you don't need all of these people, they're part of the swamp, I'll just come in and sort it all out myself. But that's his thinking.
But I think he was right on China, and I think nobody in the West, the assumption was that bringing China into the world trade system would make China look more like the world. It hasn't. And China has been taking liberties on so many fronts, and he was right to raise the issue.
Normal diplomacy was not working with China. I'm not condoning his methods, but normal diplomacy was not working. The trade deficits were absolutely enormous. The intellectual property theft was enormous. You know, talk to American, British manufacturers about how their designs have been ripped off. That system needs to be policed. It's not going to be policed by, you know, national police forces. It can only be policed by hard-nosed negotiation.
But also it has to be, you know, you can't just go for the shock tactic and the easy sell. And as, you know, as people say in the headlines, the going in, talking tough, and then not being able to sort of do anything with it and hurt your own people.
Yeah, but that whole madman theory, you can't do that out in public.
We're coming back.
To be a bit more savage.
Welcome back. If you're joining us back on the TV show, is Trump's foreign policy working? We've already just been talking about China and the trade war, and we've talked about North Korea as well. Let's move on to Iran. Obviously, Donald Trump's main foe has been for a long time now. The sanctions have been reimposed on Iran. Now we're learning that the an enormous US carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, is moving into the Middle East, which is sure to sort of stir up all sorts of controversy as well. I think we've got a couple of elements that I can just bring you. First of all, this is what the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, busy man indeed, this is what he's been saying on Iran. It's something we've been working on for a little while. It is absolutely the case that we have seen escalatory actions from the Iranians, and it is equally the case that we will hold the Iranians accountable for attacks on American interests. Is it absolutely the case that there have been direct threats from the Iranians in recent months to cause this?
I don't think it's direct against the U.S. I think this is from very early on in the Trump administration, whether it's because of his long links to Saudi Arabia. His first visit was to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia's big issue in the world is Iran and Iran's influence in the Middle East and surrounding region, and how Iran has been acting in Syria, in places like Lebanon, even in the Gaza Strip. They have long been a regional actor that is pushing in an opposite direction to America. And I think a lot of what animated Donald Trump in the beginning was just Barack Obama did a deal, I hate Barack Obama, therefore I will undo a deal. Yeah. But he was also whispered in his ear by people like the Saudis saying we have to neutralize this influence. And if you look at his foreign policy, one of the ways it makes sense is that it's always aimed at hemming in Iran in that part of the world, whether it's supporting Saudi blockades on Qatar. It's always been the Sunni Shia thing and containing Iran. So he's been quite logical there, but I don't think necessarily to America's interest.
Do you think then the Iran policy ties in quite neatly with Trump's view on Israel and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we've seen that certainly isn't being resolved anytime soon?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I very much agree with everything that Andrew said. Trump has had this obsession with Iran. I mean, Iran has been a long-standing enemy of America for a long time, and so much of the new kind of ramping up the sort of muscular activity in the Middle East is all about Iran. And absolutely Israel has played its part with all of that. In fact, you know, it was rumoured that, in fact, it was Israel who sort of encouraged Donald Trump to rip up the nuclear deal. It was rumoured that it was Israel that was saying that there is nuclear testing going on, when actually all the officials found that there wasn't nuclear activity going on in Iran. And again, it shows you that, again, I use the word capricious. It feels like it's the right word. You cannot take this man at face value. I mean, the North Koreans should think very carefully about doing any nuclear deal with Trump, because as he's shown with Iran, he can turn on a sixpence and rip it up as well. But the interesting thing is his very close, obviously very close relationship with Israel. He has said that he will absolutely, you know, he said that he will support them 100% in defending their citizens. America right now under Trump does not seem to want to try and find peace in the Middle East. He seems to want to inflame the existing very entrenched divisions. And, you know, he talks about, you know, we've had great talk about the Muslim ban and him saying that he wants to crack down on ISIS and all of that terrible kind of ideology. Well, as Andrew said, who are his best friends? Saudi Arabia. Where is quite a lot of the terrorism activity coming from? Saudi Arabia. Who is not on the banned list of Muslims coming to America? Saudi Arabia. Who's selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is perpetuating a disgusting war in Yemen? It's America.
Which perhaps ties in quite nicely with what Ab has sent.
Yeah, and the UK.
Ab says, transactional foreign policy. Someone tell Trump leadership isn't about making money alone.
Correct.
Which I suppose would be what you would reiterate as well. Speaking about the Middle East, we should probably just remind everyone that there has been a flare-up of tensions across the Israeli-Gaza border. There have been deaths on both sides. And Donald Trump has weighed in on this issue as well. Again, he took to Twitter, as you would expect. I've never got a shortage of tweets from Donald Trump. Once again, Israel faces a barrage of deadly rocket attacks by terrorist group Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We support Israel 100% in its defence of its citizens. We should point out that I think currently there are at least 20 Palestinians who have died and at least 4 Israelis who have died just in the latest round of violence.
Speaking to Aisha, it does seem a pretty incendiary thing to tweet at this time, notwithstanding losses on both sides, as we've stated here on the show. It's almost as incendiary as when Donald Trump moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Obviously, a violation in the eyes of Palestinians of Oslo Accord and America's sort of previously even-handed role as a peace broker. But just going back to Iran briefly, if I may, Hannah, Donald Trump has put himself beyond his usual allies, as Andrew was suggesting. We had the whole of the UN Security Council, plus the Germans, signing this non-proliferation deal with Iran, and of course, under Obama, and then Trump reneged on it. And he does seem to be escalating tension in Iran and goading Tehran. But I think there are 2 big checks on any belligerence in Iran by the Americans. The first is just the common sense observation that what he's succeeded in doing is marginalising President Rouhani, who's a moderate, and pushing power, giving propaganda points for the anti-US clerics that are never far from power in Iran. So that's one thing. The second thing is the oil price, and this ties in with Venezuela as well. What recently happened?
We should talk about that.
What recently happened is that Trump removed waivers on sanctions preventing the Iranians exporting oil to certain markets. The Chinese will ignore that. The Chinese will keep importing Iranian oil if they want to. Thank you very much, Mr. President. They'll do what they want. But other big countries that take Iranian oil, the Indians, the Turks, they will stop importing Iranian oil. Iranian oil will cease big time to come onto global markets, just at a time when Venezuelan oil is ceasing to come onto global markets, at a time when OPEC is constraining oil supplies because they want to push prices up. We're up around $70 a barrel now. US motorists are paying almost $3 a gallon to fill up their trucks and their cars. That hurts Trump's base. It hurts US enterprise. Of course, the shale providers like it in Texas and North Dakota, but the majority of the US economy does not like high oil prices. And that's why, in the end, I don't think he will escalate these tensions in Iran.
A couple of messages. Chakudi says, Trump's foreign policy is working, but against America's allies, so concern for all of us outside of the US. Onomi says, well, countries can no longer take America for a ride, so this strongman stance works for some people as well. Of course, we should, before we end the show, put the backdrop in context here. The backdrop is the crisis, well, some would call it a crisis, at home for the president. The Mueller probe, that report now released a redacted version of it. Donald Trump initially saying he thought it was up to the Attorney General whether Robert Mueller, the special counsel, would give testimony on Capitol Hill. Now he's backtracked and said, no, he shouldn't. He actually went as far as to say that they have stolen 2 years of my, brackets, our presidency, that we will never be able to get back, still going along this witch hunt line.
Yeah, no, and this is where you don't have to look too hard to see where his internal logic doesn't add up. If Mueller has cleared him, you would think he would want Mueller to come to committee and clear him again and again and again in a very public format. He knows, of course, that Mueller has done no such thing and has only been too polite about urging Congress to take its constitutional responsibility to investigate obstruction charges more fully. And I think that's the question we'll get out of these hearings when Mueller does come, is on the obstruction charge, why he chose to not advance things further. And his answer so far has been, it's not my responsibility to do that, it is Congress's.
Is it deflectionary tactics from Trump to sort of like, well, we've got all this crisis going on with Mueller and Russia, so I'll just talk about North Korea instead?
Oh, yeah, he always does that. That has been an absolute classic sort of go-to escape route. We call it the dead cat strategy, which is like, oh, something's happening over there. Oh, look, there's a dead cat here on the table. Look, is it dead? My goodness. You know, that's what he does. And it's very interesting that we have talked about foreign policy because actually, even though he's very much pivoted on his base and make America great and domestic, real bread and butter domestic stuff for the average, you know, American kind of family that sort of supports him, foreign policy has cast a stain over his presidency right from the start. That, you know, remember, the Mueller investigation goes to the actual heart of how he became president in the first place and whether there was foreign interference and any sort of collusion as well. So absolutely. And again, he loves the howl of betrayal. He loves to be the victim. He loves to be the person that everyone's ganging up on. Look, I don't think Mueller has an absolute slam dunk smoking gun, but I do think there is much more.
Yeah.
There's more to this story than
was
being spun. Absolutely.
We said this would happen, didn't we? When he lost the congressional midterms, the Democrats would control key congressional committees. They would have the power to subpoena and to call witnesses. This is exactly what is now happening. I think this Mueller thing's going to be dragged out right the way up to the 2020 election.
And it's a lot to do with how the Democrats play their hand.
There's a lot more to come on this.
A couple of messages before we have to wrap up. Barbara says, the USA has been a great example of the epitome of capitalism, putting money above all. Trump is representing this well. Saheed says, Trump's foreign policy is impulsive and reactive and not well thought out. And Peter says the Trump presidency is all illusion, smoke and mirrors. We've pretty much covered the globe, as the US president and his administration is doing as well at the moment. Thank you so much for watching us on Facebook, of course, and for sending all your comments in. The conversation continues there. Don't forget, you can also watch or listen back to today's programme and all of the other shows as well. Search for CNN Talk on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thanks so much.